Directed by Magnus von Horn, The Girl with the Needle follows Caroline, a young factory worker struggling to survive. When she becomes pregnant, she meets Dagmar, a charismatic woman who runs an underground adoption agency. Caroline accepts a role as a wet nurse alongside her. The film stars Vic Carmen Sonne and Trine Dyrholm. So Jeffrey, what did you think of The Girl with the Needle?
The Girl with the Needle. I think I want to say first that I completely understand why this was really buzzy out of Cannes. It wasn't like a seismic eruption like the likes of Anora, but this was definitely buzzed about. This is a movie that was picked up by Mubi, and people were certainly talking about it at the Cannes Film Festival. I also completely understand why this was nominated for Best International Feature. I'm surprised that it wasn't more of a contender for Best Cinematography, because I think that there is an amazing amount of aesthetic control in this film. Its influences seem right in my wheelhouse. Like, I was watching this film and I couldn't stop thinking about people like Bela Tarr, everything from the oppressively bleak atmosphere to the black and white cinematography to this idea of poor people like only being able to eat boiled potatoes. It's something that reminded me a lot of his film The Turn Horse. I definitely think he's all over this movie, and the same with Tarkovsky. Do you remember Stalker? Like, the way that when you watch Stalker, you can almost feel the mud and like the dampness of the buildings.
Yeah.
I haven't felt that way in a film recently, and this film reminded me a lot because every building seems to be like overwhelmingly damp and just like not
There's a griminess to it.
Yeah, like not worthy of like human inhabitants. And I always felt that way about Stalker and some other Tarkovsky's work in particular. So I felt a similar thing here. But that's not to say that this movie isn't wholly its own, because even with those two influences, there is like a psychological horror or a psychological thriller element here that I don't think is really present in their work as much. But there's like this gothic sensibility that's really infecting the frames, and I think is beautiful to look at. It's a tough watch, frankly. It's not something you're like firing up to feel good on like a weekend night, but for as impressive as this film is on a technical level, and as much of the visceral horror that I felt for a lot of it, I did kind of ask myself that eternal question with movies like this: is the pain worth it? And that's a question I guess we're going to unravel together. I do think this is a good film. I'm going to give it a positive review, but I am kind of mulling over the purpose of it being so dour, whether the thematic material of that is really worth, you know, the places that it goes to make its audience uncomfortable.
Yeah, I understand where you're going with that. I think a little bit of its dourness is a sign of the times. This film takes place, I think, in the early or right after World War II.
World War I, I think.
Oh, World War One. Okay,
Yeah.
so it's in between two world wars. Caroline, for example, the main character of the film, she is working in a clothing factory, has been converted into just making the uniforms, for example. It's a sign of the times. It's an extremely dark watch. The film is so cold that even what I think can be perceived as good in this film masks for something more sinister underneath. As you were saying with the cinematography, to add to that, the film is entirely in black and white. The set design, the characters, and the clothing is consistently mirroring all these things as well. The production and costume design are extremely fresh looking for those higher up on the totem pole, such as the people that are, you know, have more wealth in society. And as we see, the people lower on the totem pole are living pretty much in this grimy, unkept life. Some of the examples of that is like this bathhouse that all the women are going to. It does not look like a bathhouse you would want to actually get clean in, because all the corners are so dirty.
It's a necessity.
Yeah, so many of these clash division, the harsh effects of them and the harsh effects of war are clearly on display. Another example of this dark sinisterism hanging under the surface is this candy shop, which I won't go into too much detail about because I don't want to spoil the film, but this candy shop is filled with such clean and organized jars that are neatly displaying all these array of sweets. However, behind the counter lies this sinister underground ruse. The film has this really strong habit of making you feel like something's getting better, only to really pull the rug out from underneath you, revealing this dark and inescapable reality. And that's so much of what Caroline is experiencing in the film, I think. And for someone like myself, it was certainly a little difficult to get through because it is such a downer. However, I will admit it was a very potent watch, I think.
It's interesting what you mentioned about the film giving you a nice present, but then underneath it is something so ugly. That's something that I got a bit tired of, actually, as the film went on, especially after she meets the son who kind of owns the factory, at least his family owns the factory. After that played out, I kind of knew how the rest of the good things in the movie were going to play out. So I was just waiting for them to go terribly. In that mode, when the film is kind of revealing its cards too early, I start to look for the clues of things and say, what are the ways in which this is going to turn bad?
Mm.
So in that way, it was too predictable of a watch for me. I don't care much about predictability in films or knowing where things are going, but it's more that it felt like a bit of a monotonous exercise. I'm going too negative. I mean, I'm definitely like, I like this movie and I have a lot of nice things to say, but there was like a dullening and a deadening of watching it that I did feel that I wish I didn't feel.
Yeah, no, I completely understand. There is sort of like a beating of this horse that's happening with all these bad things that could happen one after another. And it does slowly descend even into worse examples of just that first one that you mentioned. So, I mean, we could start there. So we have Caroline, played by Vic Carmen Sonne, and she is playing the role of a woman and a wife whose husband has gone away to war. He hasn't returned. She is working at this factory making clothing, and she strikes up this relationship, as you said, with this owner. It's during this that her husband returns. He is alive. But for her character and her role, I thought she did just a wonderful job playing this character that I think keeps seeing the best in the people she comes across, only to be let down by them. But as one of the bright spots of the film, I do think she retains this independent and resilient nature about her. For as dark as the film does get, and for all that she's put through, I would argue that she remains pretty optimistic about the world around her. You would expect this cynicism to grow over all these experiences, but it really doesn't, I would argue. So I just found it to be an extremely entrancing performance, one where you see the light of something better as she gazes upon those that she looks up to. Some might interpret her, I think, as being a bit ignorant to the world around her and this reality, this harsh reality, but I think she just rather see the best of it and assume the goodness in everybody rather than just assuming everybody is bad-natured.
Yeah, I hadn't contemplated this actually, but I think that her steadfastness and her ability to be independent is actually progressing as the film is, because I think with each one of these scenarios that goes south, she gets progressively more aggravated and progressively more willing to take matters into her own hands, so to speak. And that goes to the ending of the film that we'll probably talk about towards the end of this review, where she really does take matters into her own hands and tries to make things right in a certain sense. I hadn't contemplated that, but it is kind of a cool character progression.
So I do want to get into her character more deeply, but there would be spoilers entailed with that. So I'm going to say pretty basic for Trine Dyrholm, but she is an absolute standout, I thought, in this film. I thought her character is so empathetic and kind-natured on the outside. There is just so much lurking underneath that without trying to say too much. So I think the way she does this and this evolution of her character throughout the film, even though it's less of an evolution and more of a realization that the audience and Caroline experience, I think she plays this like just absolutely perfectly, because you really do believe something about her, a good-naturedness that might not necessarily be the case.
Yeah, you're right. I think that her hardness as a character comes off as more of her being real and kind of tough love at first. She's able to play both of those, that you can buy this person as a tough love person who actually does care. Meanwhile, that performance makes even more sense in the film with certain revelations later. So
one thing I want to talk about, and it's something that you had mentioned briefly at the beginning of the review, I love how these elements of horror filmmaking are weaved into this film. There are some incredible uses of shadows and light in the film. For example, there's one of these scenes that features this upwards angle that looks at the staircase to the attic apartment.
that's exactly what I was thinking about.
And this is utilized multiple times in the film in different ways, you know, sometimes with Caroline's character alone, but in the case that I'm personally thinking of is with her husband after he has returned from war. It's this big surprise, and she is bringing him back to her apartment.
And this apartment seems really damp. There's just always things dripping.
Yes. And the window is hard to open.
Yeah.
And she does clean it up pretty nicely.
She
but
does, yeah.
It's not the nicest sight to behold when she first arrives there. Anyways, absolutely entrancing shot happens where she is bringing him up the stairs. He is cast in darkness. And when her landlady comes out and is like, we told you you're not supposed to have guests or people over, I just love how we just see these bleeding eyes poking out from the darkness. And then you see more, and obviously the woman is just terrified at this sight in a certain way, and she's so put off. But this is just one of many examples, I think, that the film uses these tactics of horror filmmaking to show us what a dark and tragic time it was.
Yeah, you're right. And in those ways, actually, the film reminds me a lot of like Gothic era or German expressionist films. This film is definitely throwback in an interesting way, although its themes, or maybe like the way it goes about its themes and the way it uses needles and things like that, are scenes that wouldn't make their way into an old film. So it is updated in that way, but there's something refreshingly old-fashioned about the way that it chooses its horror.
That's actually a really good point to make because it leads into a criticism that I have of the film.
Interesting.
That I think some of the filmmaking choices here resulted in the film looking too clean, which I found to be a detriment to the film. I don't know if you noticed this as well, but there's this very modern and clean aesthetic and look. There's little to no grain in the image. It's very sharp. I think this actually contrasts negatively a little bit with the film's time period and its themes, which are so dark and gritty. There were these times where I think the illusion of film and the filmmaking process was broken down for me, and I was taken slightly out of the film because of this.
I actually disagree with you a little bit. I understand what you're saying,
Yeah.
but the reason I think it works is because by the end of this film, when I was wanting more from it thematically, and then I started thinking about it in terms of almost like a dark fairy tale or like a grim fairy tale.
Yeah.
And I think in that way, it actually works really well because when I picture a fairy tale, I don't picture the kind of dustiness and griminess of film stock. I picture it more pristine, but there's something, again, dark that's underneath it. So in that framework of it being a fairy tale, I actually think that that works, but I completely understand your criticism.
Yeah, I guess it just took me out of the film a little bit because I was expecting a little bit more texture for a film that was taking place in the time period that it was. It almost felt to me like, oh, this is a film that was made in 2024.
Yeah, and we did watch it in like 4K, so it looks like really pristine. But at the same time, some of the darker parts that we talked about in the beginning, like the fact that you can feel the dampness, you can feel the mud, you can feel the creaky floorboards, I do think that adds a grit to it that does work despite it being so pristine.
So from here, I'd love to talk a little bit deeper about the film and go through some spoilers. So if you have not seen The Girl with the Needle, feel free to come back to this review afterwards. So as we were talking about earlier, Dagmar is this character that Caroline comes across in this bathhouse as she's trying to terminate her pregnancy using the needle. So that's where we come with the title of the film, The Girl with the Needle. And this was definitely not the easiest scene to watch, but Dagmar comes to her rescue essentially, and she helps her out of the tub. She cleans her up. She tells her, you know, I can take this child from you and adopt her out to a really nice family. You just hold on and you just wait. But this is where we find out through this process of their relationship that Dagmar isn't just simply adopting these children. She is brutally killing them, which is based on a true story. This actually happened.
With that revelation, there's a clear delineation of themes here, whether that be reproductive rights or female autonomy or like society's predilection for assigning roles to women that are subservient and subjugated. I wish that those themes were more thoroughly explored, like through its characterization. I realized, but it didn't really hit me viscerally or intellectually, although I will say that I think the film is very good at showing its themes through its imagery. So again, like all of the imagery and aesthetic stuff in this film is virtually perfect. I think some of the story writing and some of the screenwriting could have been a little bit deeper, especially on a characterization level. So I admire its craft so much, and I admire the boldness and frankly the willingness to push an audience to like even disgust, like let alone discomfort. It did leave me wanting with some of those ideas, but as I said before, like thinking of it on the level of a fairy tale, like a very dark and grim fairy tale, I think that this actually works pretty nicely as an allegory with these simple themes.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there's just so many of those themes that you were describing. As you were saying, it kind of visually shows you things. It doesn't tell you things. I think that extends to Dagmar's character and her motivations at the end, because we get to see in this trial, she gets to speak. In that, she explains that I was just willing to do what you all weren't willing to do. When
we see that scene, it's very much towards the end. It could work in the film as a way of complicating the theme so that we think a bit more about them and complicating her character. But at the same time, her character could be using that as an excuse for her own
behavior.
Her own behavior. What's interesting, if you think back, she stops our main character from aborting the baby, and she says babies are so precious, we'll get them to a nice family, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
So the obvious parallel, if you're taking her at her word, her obvious parallel to make is that she was performing illegal abortions for women that needed abortions, right? But that's not really what she was doing. She had an opportunity for that to happen under her nose, and instead chose to save the woman, ask her to have the child, and then bring the child to her and then proceed to murder the child.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting wrinkle. And again, I think the film's not getting too deep into it, but there is a point to be made too, I think, on a societal level. Very likely a lot of these children aren't being cared for if they're in the orphanage system or the child care system.
Yeah.
The orphanage in particular doesn't look like a place that anyone would want to grow up. So maybe there's some commentary on that too.
Going right from there, speaking about the orphanage, this is where Caroline decides to end up at the end of the film, and she actually gets Dagmar's daughter out of there and adopts her. Mm-hmm. Which is interesting because this daughter almost killed one of the babies. In context, looking back at it, because this seems very outrageous to us in the moment, but once we learn about Dagmar's true purpose and what she actually does, I think you can give the daughter a little bit of a pass because you understand that she was conditioned for this behavior.
Yeah, she thought that this behavior was normal.
Yeah, I do think for all the darkness the movie has, this is like a bright ending.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, you're right. If the film had gone on a bit longer, I would be nervous because, again, everything that's good in this film tends to be turned on its head, but it does choose to end on a note that I don't see much cynicism in. I'd be interested if any watchers or any of our channel saw any cynicism in the ending of this film, but I definitely didn't.
We also get a really nice scene, I think, to add to it with her husband, who is now in this carnival. It's this moment where she is looking through his stuff, rummaging for his morphine that he's been using for his pain. He literally remarks to her, like, you don't need that anymore. We could get through it. And it seems like he's had a progression that we're not really attuned to because we only see him at certain parts of the film, but it doesn't look like he necessarily needs it anymore as well. And I think it's just a really beautiful moment because he's rejecting her need for the medication because he realizes that something we can be something better than that now. And also they have this moment where they look in the mirror and their hands are in sync and they're doing these little motions together. I thought it was just really beautiful. I thought it meant that they were finally back on the same page.
Yes, but it's built on a fortress of lies.
Why the lies?
Because she had just lied to him in the previous scene. She didn't exactly lie. She prevaricated.
Yes.
She avoided the truth.
That is true.
What did you do with our child? And she said, I gave it away.
Yeah.
Which she did give it away, but then she knows that it was murdered. There is such a thing as white lies. In a way, you could say that his growth is necessitated by that lie, and that lie allowed him to grow. So maybe that's actually an optimistic way of seeing it. But either way, I think that it's a little complicated.
It is very complicated. And to be fair to her, she had no idea that this was going to be happening.
Oh, no, not at the time, but she did.
Yeah.
She did when she told her husband.
Yeah, very true. So you ready to go to grades?
I am. I'm going to give this film a B. I'm kind of tinkering with a B+. I guess I'll stick with a B. During our conversation, I did find that the film was a little more complicated than I thought it was initially. So I maybe want to walk back some of its simplicity, quote unquote, thematically, because just the way that some of these characters are lying to each other and lying to themselves potentially does unravel or unlock some mysteries of the film that I didn't realize before our conversation. Some of that came to me as we were talking. So I think the film actually might have like a bit more going on than I was giving it credit for at first. Let's go back to my original perspective, which is just like, you should see this film because the aesthetic control of it and the rigor is just unbelievable. I mean, it's a film of tremendous craft. And when you talk about filmmaking being a visual language, there is like poetic visual language all over this film. And no matter what I think of like how complicated or uncomplicated the thematics are or the characterizations are, the film is really effective for most of its running time. When it wants you to feel suspense, when it wants you to feel very, very uncomfortable, when it wants you to feel a little bit grossed out, it's able to get you there as an audience member. And that's probably the most ringing endorsement of all.
Yeah, I completely agree. I give the film a B+. It's probably not a film that I would return to. I think it's just extremely dark for me, to be honest. But I don't think that's a bad thing. I just think for me personally, it's just hard. It's a hard watch. Production design down to the cinematography, all those things were just so perfectly done in bringing all these specific themes and ideas and world to life. All right, and that's it for our review of The Girl with the Needle. The Girl with the Needle is now streaming on Muvi, so if you haven't seen it, go check it out. Let us know in the comments, what did you think about this film? As always, thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time.